Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to welcome you to our Global Environmental Law series, our webinar series. Over the course of the next few months, or at least between now and December, we have invited speakers from over the world to present their research. Today, we are fortunate to have with us an expert in his field, Professor Jonathan Verschieren. But before I introduce him, I am just going to say something about the house rules for the webinar today. So we are starting soon, and the idea is for Professor Jonathan to give his presentation, and we will have questions at the end. If you do have a question while Professor Verschieren is speaking or presenting, you can post it in the chat or in the Q&A. And then we will take questions at the end of the session. And you can also use, at the end of the questions, you can use the raise hand function, and you can put your camera on to ask the question if you need to. All right, so before I officially open, I would just like to give a little introduction about our speaker for today. So Professor Jonathan Verschieren is an extraordinary professor at the Global Environmental Law Center. He is also a professional of international and European environmental law at Tilburg Law School in the Netherlands. He is the EU Marie Sklodowska alumnus at the University of Sydney in Australia, and also an extraordinary professor at the Northwest University in South Africa. So strong ties to Europe, South Africa, and Australia. In 2017, he was awarded the Academy of Environmental Law Scholarship Prize. His research focuses on climate change law, and he has worked on a range of topics in the field, such as climate litigation and the relationship between climate change and biodiversity law, the enforcement thereof, so looking at the emission trading schemes, also looking at coastal adaptation, sea level rise, and climate adaptation law. His current research relates to climate adaptation, the impact of climate change on agriculture and food security, and on reducing agricultural greenhouse gas emissions. He is also currently working on a project funded by the Dutch Research Council, so the NVO, to research the possibility to integrate agricultural emissions into the EU emissions trading scheme. So enough then from me. And if I didn't already introduce myself, my name is Dr. Angela van der Berg. I'm the acting director at the Global Environmental Law Center. Professor Verschieren, thank you so much for joining us today, and I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Angela. Thank you for inviting me. I will share my screen. I hope you can all see this. And I hear nothing, so I guess that's affirmative. Thanks again for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here, and I guess this is the first webinar of the center, so it's a real honor to be the first speaker in your series. What I would like to talk about today is indeed my most recent research. The last few years, I focused my research primarily on agriculture and climate change, not only reducing agricultural greenhouse gas emissions, but also on the impacts of climate change on agriculture. So also focusing on adaptation and food security. And as will become obvious from my presentation, these things are very much related. So agricultural emissions mitigation on the one hand, adaptation on the other, and on the third pillar, food security. So how can we make sure that we will produce sufficient food in the coming decades under climate change and with a growing world population? So this will be my topic. I will first give kind of a broad introduction on the background of this issue. So looking at these three pillars: mitigation, adaptation, and food security. And then I will conclude from that we need a very broad food transition, really an agriculture and food transition that is very broad and deep, and that needs to happen globally. So it's a huge endeavor that we are embarking on and will have to embark on. In my view, it's even bigger than the energy transition, the transition that we are undergoing right now. Then, of course, being a legal researcher, I will primarily focus on the role of law. So after this introduction, I will focus on what regulatory approaches we would need to achieve this transition. And then I will focus primarily on the EU because that's my background, but I will keep it rather introductory because I'm aware that most of the participants probably do not have a background in EU law, so I will be, don't worry about that. I will not go in too much detail, but I will want to show you what types of legal instruments at the moment are being used to get this transition going and what still needs to be introduced, because at the moment the things that we have set up right now and are using right now are clearly not sufficient to get this transition going. So that's about the content of my presentation. So first, a little bit about the background, and then there are these three pillars that are important for you to understand. Otherwise, it's difficult to understand or to see the reason for this transition. First of all, agricultural emissions are about 1/4 of all anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. So, and at the moment, and this is true, I think, for most countries in the world, these emissions are not really tackled under current climate change policies. So the focus of current climate change mitigation policies is primarily focused on energy and a little bit on transportation, but not so much on agriculture yet. Although agriculture does have a big, does contribute to climate change quite substantially, as you can see from this slide. And this is both CO2 emissions, mostly through deforestation and peatlet drainage, but also primarily non-CO2 emissions from methane and nitrous oxide. And one of the major contributors is livestock raising. So livestock really is the big contributor to greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. On the other hand, agriculture also sequesters carbon. This is also important to understand, because this is also part of the regulatory picture that we have to keep in our heads. We have to make sure that all the vast agricultural lands around the world are being used in a way that takes up CO2 and sequesters that into soils and vegetation. So there's also a role for agriculture to play there. Here are a couple of images from the latest report of the IPCC from 2022, so from this year, which shows that we have rising emissions, still have rising emissions, also in this area of agriculture. So if you look at methane, which is the orange colored in the top image, you can see that this is rising. Although the percentage is going down a little bit, but that's because the contribution of methane towards the entire substances is reducing, because fossil fuels are increasing. But you can see if you look at the size of that orange band, that it is getting bigger. And this is also obvious from the below the below image, where both methane and nitrous oxide emissions are going up, as well as the LULUCF emissions, so land use change and forestry emissions. Part of the agriculture emissions are part of that group of emissions as well. So rising emissions still, also from agricultural emissions. This image shows also a little bit similar, so the contribution of the various types of agricultural emissions, and the top one is maybe the one to focus on now, which shows methane emissions, and there you can clearly see that livestock is the big problem there. Enteric fermentation makes up for the biggest part of greenhouse gas emissions from methane, and methane is a very strong greenhouse gas. It's 30 times stronger than CO2, for instance. So that's the reason why we have to focus on methane quite a lot. The good story here is, or the good news is, that methane is a short-lived greenhouse gas. So if we manage to reduce greenhouse gas or the methane emissions, then this has an immediate impact on global warming, which is different from CO2, because CO2 emissions remain active in our climate system for hundreds or even thousands of years. So there's a big difference there with methane. But it's also clear from this image that livestock is the big problem, you could say, as far as mitigation is concerned. So that's the first part of the background story. The second part is about the impact of climate change on agriculture. And again, an image from the most recent IPCC report on adaptation. I copied a small part of a bigger image focusing on 3 regions in the world: Northern Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Southern Asia. And you can see a lot of minuses there. This image shows the impact of climate change on all of these crops, on crop yields and productivity. And it's clear that, well, especially for Sub-Saharan Africa, where you guys are, there are only minuses there. So there's a negative impact on all these crops already now. This is about observed impacts now, at this time. So, and you can imagine that with growing impacts of climate change, this will only increase. So, yeah, quite a grim image, I would say. Also in Europe, we will have impacts. So the right-hand picture shows the impacts in Europe. So especially in Southern Europe, Southern European agricultural activities will be impacted a lot. And on the left-hand picture, you can see a global image. So here it's clear that the global south is especially heavily affected by the impact of climate change. So we see yields drops from up to 50%, which of course is huge. It will have a huge impact on food security. Well, talking about food security, something is happening in that region as well, because we have an increase in food demand, and there's an expected increase of more than 40% over the next decades, mostly due to population growth, but also to rise in calorie intake due to greater affluence. And this means that a lot more farmland is needed if we want to meet that growing demand. And it's also clear that if we continue to do agriculture and produce our food the way we do now, so with a strong focus on livestock keeping, that then we will run into problems, simply because there's not enough land anymore. So even if you take away the whole climate change issue, there's also a reason to reduce livestock, simply because we don't have the space that is needed, especially to grow the food for the animals. So that's we need a lot of space to grow food for the animals that we use for our own food. And there are also a lot of other issues involved. I will not go into detail on that, but agriculture is also linked to problems of biodiversity loss and increasing nitrogen and phosphate pollution in soils, water shortages, and also zoonotic diseases that are linked to agriculture. And then we have also, and it's also important to realize, that there's also a health issue involved here. We have, and there's a very recent report by the Lancet Food Commission, and it's maybe I will show this picture here. I will go back to this previous picture, but I want to show you this because this is a nice picture that shows that our food at the moment is not healthy, is unhealthy. The dotted line on the left here, you can see this is the ideal amount of food in the various categories that we should consume. And you can see that for some types of food, we are below that line, especially fruit and vegetables. But for others, we are way above, primarily red meat, starchy vegetables as well, poultry, dairy in some regions. So, and this is entirely focused only on health. So we are consuming too much red meat for our health. We are not consuming enough vegetables and fruit for our health. So there's also a health issue involved here. And we have to link all these topics together if we want to really address all of these problems, because these are not isolated issues. It's not only about climate change, it's also about food security, about healthy foods. It's also about biodiversity loss. So that is why such a broad and deep transition of the entire agriculture and food sector is needed. Well, I skipped this picture. This shows the expected amount of food insecurity due to climate change. And again, this picture shows that especially in Africa, but also India and China, impacts will be really big. So, well, if you look at this image, for instance, the larger persons that you can see in this image means that between 35 and 70% of the people are undernourished. So this is, well, quite substantial. So a lot of things that need to happen. We need to address this, and fortunately, there are ways to do this. So it's not a hopeless situation here, because we have all kinds of technological fixes that we can apply. Methane capture and conversion into biogas, for instance, in livestock keeping, precision agriculture, genetic modification, even cultured meat. There are lots of other technological fixes that we can use, and we can focus on behavioral changes. So both at the side of the farmer, so there are all kinds of more sustainable ways of growing food, both livestock keeping and crops that are good, not only for climate change, but also for biodiversity and for resilience. To agroforestry, for instance, is a very nice example of that. Crop rotation, soil carbon sequestration, organic farming, all of these types of farming that make sure that you have less emissions, less greenhouse gas emissions, that you have more resilient soils, more resilient crops that can better deal with changing climatic situations. And you can also focus on consumer. Consumer can also change its behavior, for instance, by reducing animal-based diets, reducing food waste. So that's also, the consumer definitely also has to be part of the regulatory focus. And then we have other stakeholders that are relevant, like supermarkets and investment banks in the agriculture sector. And yeah, generally all these types of changes that are required are labeled under the heading of climate smart agriculture, which is a type of agriculture that tries to reduce its emissions, adapt to the changing climate, and increase food production. So working on those three issues at once, at the same time, that is called climate smart agriculture. This is an image from an earlier IPCC report from 2019 on land use, which also lists all these food system response options. I'm not going to go into all of these. It's just to show you that we have a huge amount of response options that are both good for mitigation and adaptation. I think this is also nice from this image that you can see the two columns on the right. And you can see that a lot of these response options are beneficial for mitigation and adaptation at the same time. And maybe just to give one example, soil carbon sequestration reduces the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, of course, but also increases soil health. So you have more resilient soils that are that have a better hydrological situation. So the water retention level is much higher of those soils, and generally crop production goes up if you sequester more carbon in the soil. So this is a good example to show that all of these three things, mitigation, adaptation, and food security, often can go hand in hand. This image, also from the most recent IPCC report from this year, shows the impact of dietary choices on mitigation. And well, this almost like an open door, but it's clear that beef from cattle has a if you can reduce the intake of cattle beef, then that has a big positive impact on greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, let's move to the law. In my work, I usually start from the work of Gunningham and others who have designed or have done a lot of theoretical work on policy and legal policy design in trying to achieve a cleaner environment, a more healthy and more sustainable type of industry and also agriculture. In their work on agriculture, they are very much aware of the very specific situation that we have in agriculture. And and this is a quote from one of their publications, they say, trying to achieve sustainable agriculture is a very considerable policy challenge because of the characteristics of the sector. We have large-scale producers, but we also have small family businesses. We have historical reliance on subsidies and price supports. There's a political culture of farming that promotes independence and resists regulation. That's at the moment in the Netherlands quite a big issue at the moment, because we have a huge uprising of farmers because they protest against new environmental policy measures that will be imposed. So we have quite a lot of issues at the moment here, especially on this characteristic. Globalization is a big factor. Food market is a global market, so it's very difficult to regulate that market from country by country. And we have this rationalization of economies at scale, which is also partly linked to the previous point of globalization. So it's a difficult sector to regulate, and the main, if you want to summarize the work of Gunningham and others on smart regulation, because that's how they labeled this, we need a very big instrument mix. So you need a policy mix where you use different types of instruments, where you use different types of institutions and stakeholders, and you have to have a kind of an orchestrated approach towards getting this transition going. And you need to use all kinds of instruments focused on different types of players, and you need to involve all relative actors and institutions so that everybody plays his or her role, and to make sure that all instruments do what they need to do, and then together, hopefully, you can then achieve this transition. So if I try to summarize it in this sentence, we need an adequate regulatory design with conscious and effective combination of different types of regulatory instruments into complementary combinations, facilitating third-party action, involve banks, insurers, and other non-government institutions, and also consumers. So all actors have to be focused on, and you need a lot of different instruments to do that, and to make sure that all these actors start to change their behavior, not just farmers, but also all other actors that are involved in the food sector. Well, this is of course easier said than done. How do you do that? Let's make it more specific and more. Let's turn now to some legal instruments that we have, or at least within the European Union, they are now trying to use to get this transition going. At the moment, so if you look at current EU law focused on agricultural greenhouse gas emissions, then there are actually three types of policy instruments that are relevant. First is the effort sharing regulation. This is a regulation in the area of climate change law, and all agricultural emissions are part of that regulation. The regulation basically requires the EU member states to develop their own policies to reduce the emissions in all kinds of sectors that are not part of the emissions trading system. So in Europe, we have an emissions trading system for industry and for energy production. All other sectors are part of the effort sharing regulation. And for those sectors, member states have to develop policies focused on reducing emissions for all these other sectors. But there's a lot of freedom for member states to decide which sectors they will target and how they will achieve the required emission reduction. And throughout Europe, well, practically all member states have decided or have chosen not to target agricultural emissions. So they primarily focus on other sectors than agriculture. Then we have so not much is happening under this regulation, although formally agricultural emissions are covered here. Then we have the so-called LULUCF regulation, which is about emissions on land use change, and forestry. And here it's a little bit similar. So for this sector, for these sectors, member states have to achieve a certain emission reduction, but it's up to the member states to decide which sectors they will target primarily. And for agriculture, and this is a little bit complicated, but agricultural emissions fall partly under the LULUCF regulation. Under LULUCF, this is a term that is also used by the IPCC and by the United Nations. Emissions that are connected to land use, so also agricultural land use, like emissions from cropland or grassland or forestry, those emissions fall under LULUCF, but emissions from individual animals, so from cattle or from pork or chicken or any animals that are used in agriculture, those emissions are not LULUCF emissions. So those emissions fall under the effort sharing regulation and not under LULUCF regulation. So, but again, the takeaway message here is that under the current LULUCF regulation, member states do not really target agricultural emissions at the moment. Then the third instrument that we have is the Common Agricultural Policy. This is already a very old instrument that exists for decades already. And this is an income support instrument. So it primarily provides income support for farmers. And farmers that, it's a subsidy instrument, so farmers that want to apply for this instrument and want to get subsidy have to comply with all kinds of rules, and environmental rules and climate change rules are part of that system. And again, I will not go in detail. There are a couple of specific rules here on this slide, but I will not deal with it. Just again, the takeaway message here is that already under the current Common Agriculture Policy, or CAP as it is called, farmers can get money, can get subsidies if they switch to a more sustainable and a more climate-friendly type of agriculture. However, that is not really happening. So if we look at the CAP at the moment, there have been a couple of evaluations. And since this instrument is primarily an income support or subsidy instrument and not really primarily a climate change instrument, there are all kinds of misfits between climate change policy goals and this instrument. Again, there's a list here, maybe just to take out one example. You can already apply for a subsidy or get a subsidy if you take measures for a short period of time between 1 and 5 years. Then you already get your subsidy for being climate friendly. But of course, so for instance, if you plant natural vegetation on your agricultural land, you get this money, and then after 5 years you can cut down everything again or even burn it, and nothing happens. And of course, this does not make sense from a climate change perspective. So you need much longer commitment periods of up to 100 years or maybe even longer. So this is just one example to show that there's a misfit between climate change goals and agriculture policy instrument of the CAP at the moment. And a very recent report by the European Court of Auditors, which is an institution that checks whether the money of the EU is spent in a decent way. They evaluated the spending of 100 billion euros of funds under this Common Agriculture Policy that was provided to farmers for climate change measures. And they checked what the contribution was of that money to emission reduction, and the staggering outcome of that evaluation was that there were no greenhouse gas emissions reductions whatsoever as a consequence of this spending of 100 billion euros. So 100 billion euros was spent on something, and that was not achieved at all. So this shows that this instrument is not working, and I already said something about the other two instruments, that they're not really being applied at the moment on agriculture. So a lot needs to change. A lot is going to change, because we now have a new policy framework set up under the so-called European Green Deal and the farm to fork strategy. So these are broad policy plans that try to get a transition to a more sustainable and environmentally friendly food system and agriculture. And a lot of legislative proposals have been presented, not much on agriculture though, but there are a couple of changes that are relevant. First of all, and well, probably most importantly, the LULUCF regulations will be amended so as to include also methane emissions and other non-CO2 emissions, but especially methane emissions from livestock. So, and this is a really big change, because, well, you saw from the first slides that especially methane emissions from livestock make up a big part of the greenhouse gas emissions, and they will be brought under the LULUCF regulation. And the goal will then be that there has to be a balance between emissions and uptake of CO2 in the entire LULUCF sector, so including all agricultural emissions, as of 2035. So methane emissions that still exist after 2035 have to be so small that they can be taken up by other activities, such as soil carbon sequestration or planting of vegetation on agricultural lands, or increased forestry measures, because the entire sector also includes forestry here. And after 2035, there has to be the balance has to be below zero, so more uptake than emissions. So this is a very interesting, a very big change, very drastic change also, but it's still far ahead in the future. So this is only happening in more than 10 or 13 years from now. So, and this still is only a proposal, so it still needs to be adopted. Then there's a proposal to further reform the Common Agriculture Policy so as to free up more budget for climate change measures, and also generally to make it more interesting and attractive for member states to develop policies on carbon farming. Carbon farming is an instrument to reward farmers, to finance farmers for the amount of CO2 that they sequester, either through soil carbon sequestration or through vegetation. So that's an interesting development as well. But the systemic changes of the cap are not happening. So it's still an instrument focused on subsidies. It's still primarily an income support system. So a lot of people, including myself, wonder whether this will really bring a lot of benefits for climate change policies. And then there's a very recent proposal to regulate livestock farms under the Industrial Emissions Directive. This is very interesting because this is a very strong command and control type of instrument under industrial environmental legislation. So all big industrial plants have to have a permit with all kinds of strict emission targets and requirements that they have to meet. Farms are not part of it, except for some really large livestock farms. But now the plan is to regulate also smaller livestock farms under this directive. And this will then allow authorities to use this instrument of permits to reduce methane and ammonia emissions and other emissions that are from livestock. So this is an interesting new development. Again, this is only a proposal, so we have to wait and see whether it will be adopted. I think there will be a lot of opposition against this measure because, as I already said, farms are not really, or farmers, I should say, maybe are not a big fan of command and control type of regulation, to put it mildly. And then, as was already said in the introduction by Angela, there's also the emissions trading system. So I already said that the emissions trading system is the main climate change instrument in Europe, but it focuses entirely on industry and on the energy sector. At the moment, we are investigating whether it's possible to also require farmers for their emissions to surrender allowances. Under the emissions trading system, industries have to buy emission rights, allowances that are equal to the amount of their emissions. Farms are not included here, but you could do this, and this instrument works really well at the moment. There were a lot of problems in the past, but at the moment it has been completely redesigned and changed, and now it works quite well. So it's a successful instrument. So it would be a good idea, I think, to also have a look at agricultural emissions, especially livestock emissions. But then, of course, one of the issues is that we have a lot of farms in Europe, and many are small family farms. And this is quite an elaborate system, very difficult to manage. You need a lot of administrative skills to do that. And for big industries, it's not a problem, but for small livestock farms, it's impossible to be really involved and working in the ETS. So either you can only focus on big livestock farms, but you can also maybe focus on other industries in the sector, like the dairy and meat industry and slaughterhouses. There's a proposal, for instance, to require those industries to surrender allowances for all the emissions involved in the production of meat, including the phase where the animals are still on the farm. And then you have a much smaller group of actors that you need to regulate, and it's much easier to do. So that's one part of this of our research at the moment. How can we, or is it possible to also require emitters in the food industry to surrender allowances? Another option would be to allow offsets to be financed under the ETS. This is not happening in Europe at the moment, but other emission trading systems do have that. In Canada and California, for instance, and also Australia has something similar, where regulated industries like the energy sector or chemical industries can invest in projects on farms, mitigation projects that take place on farms, and the emission reductions that are achieved in this project can then be used by this regulated industry to show that they have sufficient allowances or emission rights to cover their own emissions. And this is a very interesting way that allows farmers to invest in cleaner ways of production, in more climate-friendly ways of production, because they get paid for these investments. So it's not their own money, it's money from the industry that they can use. And there have been some evaluations of examples in other countries, like especially in Australia, because this has already been working for quite some time now, for almost 10 years. And there the evaluations are quite positive. So it is clear that farmers indeed are benefiting from this instrument, and also the environment is benefiting, because if you design this well, then you can see a lasting positive impact on greenhouse gas emissions and also on adaptation. So this is a very interesting instrument to use. And then there's another option that is discussed in literature, and that is to simply regulate the amount of livestock and to make sure that you only can have the amount of livestock that can be sustained by a certain area of land that the farmer owns. And we already have examples of that in the EU for organic farming, but you could also apply this for all farming. So this is also an instrument that is being discussed. But then we also have instruments that also have to be considered, taxes and subsidies, focusing on those products that are associated with a lot of emissions, like meat or dairy, and subsidies for vegan or vegetarian alternatives, this is definitely something that needs to be part of the instrument mix as well. And it's also important to not focus only on legal instruments and economic instruments that you put in legislation, because we know from research that especially if you want to change dietary choices, then you also need other interventions, non-regulatory interventions like social media, the use of role models, education. These can be very powerful if you want to influence the consumer. So also non-legal, non-regulatory interventions have to be part of the instrument mix that has to be designed. Well, that was a lot of information. Apologies for that, but I think my main message is that yeah, you need to look at this issue in a holistic way, and you need to design a large set of instruments that combined all together get the transition going towards a more sustainable and more climate-friendly food system. My presentation primarily focused on Europe, but and I especially want to say that I'm not really targeting subsistence farming, because that's a completely different story. But farmers, large-scale farming that we see in Asia, across Europe, in South America and North America, and also parts of Africa. I think those types of farming need to be addressed in this way. And yeah, it's also clear that this needs to happen fast, because the impacts of climate change are occurring rapidly already now. And yeah, we cannot wait anymore. So I will stop the share, and thank you for your attention. And I'm happy to take any questions that you have.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jonathan. That was a really insightful presentation. Also, given the fact that South Africa is currently working on our agricultural law or laws, we're in consultation, and government is thinking about ways to sort of reduce the impact of climate change or the emissions of the agricultural sector, and how we would go about that. I don't see any chats in the question or in the chat box, but then again, I don't know. I think there may have been an access issue with typing in the questions or chat box. Is there anyone here who would like to use the raise hand function to ask a question? All right, I see one question. I'm just going to see if there are any other questions. All right, there is a question from Dr. Jean-Claude Achukem. I'm going to give him the floor, and then we can ask or give opportunity for other questions.
Hello, everyone. Also, student, thank you so much for that insightful presentation, although it was also scary. Yeah, and that brings me to my worry, and especially the chat that you talked about, the differences in choices in terms of livestock consumption, that people tend to consume more beef than poultry product, and as a result, there is a problem with the production of food for this livestock, and you think that change of choice can be an option. So my fear is, how do you regulate choices in this interface? That is one, and then two. You at the end you mentioned something about tax tax, meat tax, that an option could be to for the government to introduce meat tax to actually reduce the number of meat consumers, so that they could also find alternative in poultry product. So my fear is, my question is, do you think this can be practicable? Because in South Africa, I quite remember there was a period where the government increased cigarette tax on consumers, but it didn't in any way stop the number of people smoking cigarette. Instead, it actually increased it actually encouraged some other people to actually indulge in the activity. And if we go back into the law of demand and supply, where some people will actually find it a privileged good to actually consume meat than to consume poultry product, no matter the tax on beef. How do you think that will really be feasible in the long run, especially in the context of Africa?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a very good question. It's probably also I think it's the elephant in the room. It's the biggest question that we have. It's already difficult to regulate farmers, as I indicated, different reasons for that. So that's already difficult, but regulating everybody, because we're all consumers, we all have breakfast in the morning and we all have dinner in the evening. This is really, this is a huge challenge. And there's no single instrument that you can have. And that is why I'm stressing that you need a really large set of instruments that make maybe little changes across the board. And then hopefully all of these changes together slowly will start to change behavior of consumers and change of dietary systems and dietary choices. And you mentioned taxes. That is only one of these instruments. So you definitely will need that. You have to raise the price of animal-based food products. You can do that by introducing taxes, but also the emissions trading proposal that I did will also have the same impact, because this will make the production of meat more expensive, because you have to buy carbon credits or allowances on the carbon market for your emissions that are associated to the production of meat and of dairy. And it's not only beef, but also poultry. So that will also lead to a price increase of meat products and dairy products. But that definitely is part of the picture. And then, of course, the big question will be, how much will that tax have to be? Because if it's just little, it will happen exactly what you say. So nothing will change. People will just pay a little bit more, and then they will keep on doing what they always did. So you really have to have quite a substantial price increase. But then, of course, you have to make sure that people have alternatives. Because if you only increase the price and there are no alternatives, then you make it more difficult. Then life becomes more expensive for people, and you make it more difficult for people to get the food. So you have to make sure that there are sufficient alternatives, and those you can also stimulate, for instance, by subsidies. So making sure that there are sufficient alternatives in place, that the market responds to this, to the impact of taxes, by introducing vegetarian alternatives or vegan alternatives. And you can, in your tax system, for instance, by bringing them under a low VAT tariff, or have no VAT at all for those. So only VAT for animal products, but no VAT for vegetables, fruit, and vegetarian alternatives for meat. In that way, you can use the price mechanism in both directions, making one thing more expensive, making the alternative cheaper and more interesting for consumers. So this definitely has to be part of the picture, but it's much broader than that. You also need the non-regulatory interventions. And what's interesting, so there's quite a lot of research on this in Europe actually at the moment, under young people. So young people in a lot of countries are very much into vegetarian food and vegan food. And this is not because of these instruments, because they don't exist yet, although there are some countries that are now introducing a meat tax very carefully, just a little amount. But still, and this is mostly due to the impact of social media, there's quite a big population of younger people who characterize themselves as being vegetarian or vegan in countries like the UK, for instance. And this is a rapidly growing group of people. So yeah, these are very, very important processes in society at large that you also need to somehow, as a policymaker, need to be aware of and try to tap in on and make sure that you use and even push further these developments. So yeah, so you need really a broad approach to achieve this.
Thank you, Jonathan. There is also 2 questions in the chat. I'm not sure if you can see them in the Q&A box. So both are from Veronica Taylor. The first remark or question, Veronica says, great presentation, thank you. In proposing smart regulation approaches, how much reliance can we place on the role of the consumer, pressure, and/or potential challenges in consumer behavior? For example, affluent consumers in the global north dramatically reducing their meat consumption, or would that just be a change in margins? And then there is another question as to whether you are dismissing the possibility of regulating family-owned or small farms as in Europe as too complex. And is that an example?
Yeah, thank you, Veronica. These are really excellent questions. Yeah, the first question, I think the image that I showed of the EAT Lancet report, that had different colors for different regions of the world, and it was clear that especially in the US and or North America and Europe, meat consumption is way above what is healthy, let alone the impacts on climate change. And for other regions, it's actually below that line, or at least much lower. So you have to differentiate indeed between different regions, and you have to develop the policies based on the consumption patterns in your own country. And this can be very different in different countries. And it's clear that especially in Europe and in North America, but also Australia and maybe also South Africa, I guess also in South Africa, yes, I would say, given your preference for meat. So in these type of countries, you need to primarily focus on livestock emissions. In other countries where this is much less so, where there's much more where livestock consumption or meat consumption is not really a big issue, neither from climate change policy perspective and health policy. Probably the other problem is there much bigger. So there you have a deficiency in the consumption of vegetables and fruit. So that is something that you would have to focus on there then. So I agree that you have to differentiate, and you have to focus on the situation in the country or region at hand. One thing that I still want to add here is that the complexity here, however, is the fact that the food market is a global market. So much of the food that is grown for our cattle, and the cattle in North America and in anywhere, is grown in developing countries. So it's developing countries forests that are cut down to make room for agriculture, but that agriculture there is mostly to grow food for our animals, and then the consumption of the meat takes place in the north, but the production of the animal fodder takes place in the south, the global south. So this is a complicating factor that also needs attention. And then small family-owned farms. Yeah, that's so. What I was referring to primarily is that if you want to apply the emissions trading system in its entirety to those farms, then that will be impossible because it's too complex, and you simply cannot do that. You need a whole staff of trained people and skilled people to be able to administer that system and your role in that system as a company. So that is not possible. However, the Australian example shows that it is possible to have all kinds of environmental friendly and climate change friendly projects on small family farms. And in that way, so carbon farming projects basically, where farmers, for instance, introduce projects to increase the soil carbon sequestration, or to plant natural vegetation on edges, for instance, of land that they don't use for production anyway, or to install biogas installations in their livestock houses, farming buildings. So those types of projects are very well are very interesting for small family farms, and that is much easier to organize. Again, it's not simple, and in practice, so the Australia example showed that small family farms always hire consultants to organize this for them. So there's a whole business of so-called carbon agents, or aggregators, as they are called. Also in Canada, it's the same happening there as well, where you simply get a consultant, and the consultant organizes everything for you. So the consultant does the application under the laws. The consultant makes sure that all the monitoring and registration is taken care of in a legally sound way, so that you don't run into problems later. And if you can hand over these legal and administrative burdens to an external consultant, then this is a way to solve the problems for small family farms. Of course, this goes at a price, because in Australia, for instance, it is clear, or it was shown in the evaluation there that I did myself, that about 1/3 of the entire budget goes to consultants. So that's the consequence, because those consultants won't do this for nothing. They want to have part of the budget that they bring in. But still, it's interesting enough. So from a financial perspective, 2/3 of the money then goes to the farmer. They get the income, the extra income, because of the projects that they do. And what is also very interesting in these projects is that there are many co-benefits. So it's not only about reducing your emissions, but it's also you have more resilient land. You have more if you have more vegetation. Your animals have shade in times of a heat wave, for instance. The soil is much healthier. You have more water retention. So there are a lot of co-benefits that are very interesting for the farmer. So even without the financial benefit, they already find this an interesting type of doing business, because at least that's what the experience has been in Australia, because it also brings them other benefits: better production, better crops that lead to higher prices on the market, for which they can get higher prices. So there are a lot of benefits that are also there, and that is why I think, especially for small family farms, we should also allow this option.
Excellent, thank you. Jonathan, there is another question, and then I might also jump in with a question. So the first question is from Habib, asking do you think that the consumption of edible insects can be an alternative to livestock consumption, and also as a means of regulating methane emissions? And then I have a question, if I can ask. So if I'm not mistaken, there's been quite a lot, there was a strong response from farmers in the Netherlands concerning the regulations for greenhouse gas emissions in the industry. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that. What was the process involved? What were the main concerns of the farmers? To what extent was there public participation? And what is the Dutch government doing about that now?
Okay. Well, first question by Habib. Hi, Habib. Nice to see you again, or at least read your words again. Yeah, that's a good point. This is also part of the solution. And there are a couple of examples. I mean, this is, I think, starting now. And I'm not a specialist here, so I'm a lawyer. So I'm not really a specialist about all these kind of things. But I know that generally it is seen as an important alternative, especially in products that have processed meat. So you have a lot of these kind of products in supermarkets that have a little bit of meat in them. All of that can easily be replaced without any impacts on taste by using insects, and that well, there are a couple of examples already in Europe, also in the Netherlands, actually quite close by to where I am right now. There's a big industry that has already been there for, I think, about 10 years, and they grow insects for the production of food. So this definitely is a environmental friendly and climate friendly alternative that also has to be part of the of the instruments. So if you want to focus on, or if you want to stimulate alternatives for meat, then this definitely also needs to be part of that package. But there are all kinds of questions involved there, because I know from this company that is here in this area that they had, especially in the beginning, had a lot of problems because all the food legislation is not really designed for this. So they were considered to be producing novel foods, and novel foods are always considered or always regulated in a way that is very based on the precautionary principle, also very much focused on trying to prevent anything that could be dangerous for human health. So it's very difficult to introduce those new types of food, even if they are good for the environment. So there are still challenges if you want to do that. Well, then Angela's question. Yeah, at the moment, so the debate in the Netherlands is about nitrogen deposition. So this is already a very old debate, actually. We have very big livestock farms in the Netherlands, and together they produce so much ammonia emissions that the amount of nitrogen, because ammonia converts to nitrogen when it's on the soil. So the levels of nitrogen have risen tremendously, with a very negative impact on nature. So biodiversity is going down. The quality of nature has been affected quite severely, to such an extent that courts have now said that all kinds of projects that lead to even more emissions of nitrogen and ammonia are no longer allowed. So even building a new road or even a residential area is no longer allowed. So everything has come to a grinding halt in the Netherlands, all kinds of activities, because of the high levels of nitrogen deposition on protected areas, because that's the focus. The focus is primarily on protected areas that have to have a certain level of quality. And nitrogen, the amount of nitrogen that's in the soil is one of the indicators. And this is under EU law. So now finally, after decades of having very poor soft legislation in place that did not really tackle the problem, finally the new government has said, now we are really going to address this, and now all nitrogen deposition has to be reduced by 50% at least in the Netherlands. Or no, not at least, on average 50% throughout the entire country. This means that livestock numbers will have to go down in some areas, that farms will have to be closed down, or at least farmers have to switch, have to move away from livestock farming to something else. And the government has announced that they will first try to do this in a kind of cooperative way, trying to see if farmers want to, because we have quite a large number of old farmers that have no one to take over their farm. So those farmers can be persuaded to simply stop and buy out those farmers. And the idea is to first try to have this approach, and maybe some farms can be moved to other locations, less close to protected areas, so where the impact is not so big. So there are all kinds, and there are also technical measures that can be taken to reduce nitrogen emissions. But when that does not work, then the government already said, then we will also expropriate farms and simply close down farms if necessary. Well, the uprising has been quite strong in the Netherlands against that. And it's not entirely clear, I think, whether this really is something that's supported by the vast majority of farmers, because there's a small but very vocal and also a violent group of farmers that gets all the attention, and that has protests of blocking roads, of dumping asbestos in areas, of burning down trees. They have really very violent protest measures, and they are getting a lot of room in the media and in the public debate. And only the organic farmers have said, well, we are in favor of having this transition. Let's talk and let's see how we can organize everything in a more environmental friendly way. But that's a small group also. So, and it's unclear what the big majority of the silent farmers think. But it's clear that the whole process has completely run out of hand. So there's been a talk last Friday, first time that the government talked to the farmers, the protesting farmers, and nothing came out of that talk. The positions only became more opposed. So at the moment, there's no end to this in sight. And yeah, so, and the main reason I think for this is that the government simply did not tackle this problem on time and in a planned way, in an orderly way. And they simply said, okay, now things really have to change. And one of the issues also is that they only focus on nitrogen. And this seems for a lot of people to be only a small issue. It's only about nitrogen levels in some specific protected areas. But in fact, it's a much bigger problem. As I indicated in my presentation, this is also about climate change. It's also about food security. It's also about healthy food. And what should have happened, I think, is first the government should have designed a new agriculture policy for the entire sector, a new vision on future agriculture and food situation in the Netherlands. That would have been much better, because then you could have designed a policy framework and also an instrument mix that tries to help farmers to transition to more environmentally friendly types of farming. Because recent research that was carried out in the UK shows that almost all farmers are actually, they want to change. They want a more environmentally friendly farming system. They simply don't know how. They don't know where to start. They're completely tied up in all kinds of contracts with banks, with loans. They have to, with supermarkets, they have to deliver a certain amount of products for years and years in the future. So they're completely tied up to all kinds of legal constraints, and they don't know where to start. They can't just change. It's very difficult for them. So you need to give some perspective for them, and you have to help them. And that is all missing. So the government did not design that future, its vision on what agriculture has to look like in 2030 or 2050. They only focus on nitrogen deposition and on reduction of emissions of ammonia of livestock farms. And in that way, farmers, they feel that they've been abandoned because all they did was under the current laws. So they were allowed to expand their stocks, their livestock, and they were allowed to emit more and more and more. And this was all legal. And now suddenly they have to change everything overnight. And this was not a smart move, I think, from the government. Yeah.
Thank you. It's such a fascinating example, the Dutch example, and of course, it's different context. Given the size of the country, the size of available land, if we compare that to South Africa, but I think there are still valuable lessons that the South African government or any other government can learn in terms of what the Dutch government perhaps should have done, like you say, developing that national policy first and setting out goals. Before I ask another question, are there questions from anyone else in the audience? I don't see anything in the chat at the moment, but feel free to raise your hand. I don't necessarily want to put someone on the spot, but I see that my PhD student is here, Mr. Chaslin Caesar, and he's working on industrial factory farming in South Africa. So I wonder if Chaslin, you may have a question for Prof. Jonathan. This is a great opportunity to ask him. I will then ask a question just to give other people a chance to think of a question if they might have. I don't know. I wonder, there is a trend, at least in climate litigation, where we are holding, or where communities are trying to hold large corporations accountable for their emissions, like Shell and BP and so on. Would you foresee, or is it unimaginable, or do you think anyone would start bringing large farming corporations to court for their failure or perhaps slow response to curbing emissions in their sectors? Do you think that we will see court cases like that?
Yeah, I think we will. In the Netherlands, an environmental NGO has already now targeted all kinds of other companies for their emissions. So it's still in a pre-court phase. So they've sent out letters to a range, dozens really, of companies that also emit greenhouse gases, and that, according to them, do not do sufficient or do not take sufficient action to reduce those emissions. And they already indicated that if the response is not satisfactory, then they will also start to sue those other companies. And you can imagine, so if you, in Europe, we only have a few really large meat processing companies, for instance. These are just, I don't know, 5 or 10 companies that produce all the meat in Europe. And also for dairy, it's the same. So these are huge multinational corporations that are in a lot of countries around Europe. And together, if you require them to also reduce emissions more downstream in the process, so also if you also include emissions that take place on the farms of the dairy farmers who produce the milk that then is processed by these companies, for instance. And you can also even require them or focus on emissions that are associated to the growth of the fodder, to the harvesting of animal food for those for that cattle, for instance, even in developing countries. So if you all combine all of those emissions, then these are very large emissions. And you could argue that in the end, it's the meat processing industry or the dairy industry that brings this to the market, this product. There, I definitely think that this will happen. Actually, in the US already there are, I think, cases that are already in the pipeline against these large meat producing companies. So yes, I'm sure that we will see those types of cases as well in the future.
Great, thank you. Are there any further questions from the audience? You can post in the question and answer box or in the chat. I don't see any questions. I might ask another question. I will say, I think especially in South Africa, the agricultural sector is largely ignored when it comes to climate change. We focus on mining, there's a small focus on transport, but not really, and some industries, but not really agriculture. But I was wondering, and I think that might be similar across the world, depending where, but I was wondering, we tend to blame dairy and meat farmers or those sectors, but what is the state of regulation, or is it a blanket regulation, for example, on soy or almond milk? Those sectors, I think that they also have quite a significant impact as far as emissions are concerned, but I speak under correction. That is not my area. And then there is also a question in the chat from Andrea. Would you like me to read you that question, or do you first want to answer my question?
Yeah, I might answer your question by showing a slide. I will try to get back to one of my slides, because here it actually shows. Oh, here you can see the impact of different types of food on the climate, so the greenhouse gas emissions intensity. And here you can see that soy milk actually is not that big of a problem. You can see it's over here. Same for tofu. So most alternatives for meat and dairy are actually not a huge problem. They're not entirely so they don't have no greenhouse gas emissions, but it's considerably less than these other products. So, but you are right that we have to also regulate those, especially with soy. Of course, it's well known that virgin forests are often cleared for that type of production. So that, of course, also needs to be regulated. You cannot just allow unregulated alternatives to enter the market. So because all food has an impact on the environment, every type of food that we produce. So and you can also imagine if you have more plants, then there's a risk that more pesticides will be used. So this can also have a negative impact on the environment. So you also need to regulate pesticide use. So in my ideal model, you can see that a lot of livestock farmers would switch to growing crops, plant-based food. I think that's also missing now in the Netherlands in the debate with all those protesting farmers. The farmers generally say they want us to stop. They want us out. That's the main message that they get, and that's not really the message that the government is conveying, but that's the feeling that farmers get if they read all these policy goals. But that, of course, will be a very stupid thing to do because we need all those farmers. If you remember my slide with the increase in food demand, we need all the farmers that we have at the moment, but they need to produce the food in a different way, in a way that is more productive for us. So we need more food production, but in a less harmful way. So livestock farmers ideally would need to switch to growing crops and producing plant-based food. But of course, that needs to be regulated because that will also have an impact on the environment. And and I think that is also some part of the whole deal. It's the same. I also often make the comparison to the energy transition. So we need more wind generated energy, but this doesn't mean that you can just put windmills everywhere. We also have rules on those where you can locate them. You need to do an environmental impact assessment on beforehand. You need to assess the impacts on biodiversity, also noise and all kinds of negative impacts on local residents. So yeah, you also need to regulate the alternatives.
Indeed. It also makes me realize that transition of knowledge, I guess, and capacity building for farmers currently in livestock farming in those sectors, the role of government perhaps in assisting them make that switch, whether it's through education and training. I'm thinking specifically about a country in South Africa, a country like South Africa. We would really have to equip livestock farmers to make that transition.
Yeah, but that's the same. But that's the same everywhere. So this is also one of the things that went wrong, in my view, in the Netherlands. So what they should have done, they should have set up a whole group of people or an institute that simply goes to every farmer, sits at the kitchen table with them and discuss their wishes, their options. This is something that should happen at a very individual level before you, and this should be, maybe this should be even the most important policy instrument that you use. Go to farmers and help them in an individual way. That, I think that is really what is missing here. And that is why there's so much resistance.
Indeed, thank you. That, I guess, also brings us to another question in the chat from Ms. Andrea Kamfer. She asks about what your opinion might be on implementing a carbon tax on the agricultural sector in a country like South Africa. Whether you think it would be successful, what impacts you think it would have on the consumer. So this is very focused on South Africa. I know your research is on the EU. but perhaps you can draw from what you've seen in the Dutch perspective.
Yeah, so in most countries, carbon tax is not applied to agriculture, or I don't think even in any country. We have a meat tax, but that is in some countries, but that is at a later stage. So this is more taxing meat when it's sold. So the supermarket then has to put a higher price on the meat product, and then that higher price goes to the government. The supermarket still negotiates the price with the farmer. If you would impose a carbon tax on emissions generated on the farm, then this definitely will have a big impact on farmers. And again, I would say you have to make this part of a much bigger instrument mix, because there have to be alternatives. If the farmers, for instance, are tied to all kinds of contracts that do not make it possible to transfer this tax to the consumer or to the supermarket, then of course this has an impact on budgets of farmers and on economic viability of farms. And if that farmer doesn't have an alternative, then yeah, this means negative impact on livelihoods of farmers, of farming communities. So this is not something that you can just introduce lightly. You have to make sure that there are alternatives. For instance, that there are possibilities for those farmers who want to switch to other types of farming that do not go with these taxes. Then those alternatives should be available. So yeah, I would be very careful not to just, if you have a carbon tax for industries, simply expand that to farmers at some point without assessing what could be the impact on individual farmers.
I agree. I think a better alternative would be incentives or a form of a tax rebate for farmers that want to use more green approaches to farming in the country. All right. Are there any further questions from the audience? I think we have answered most of them. Okay. I don't see any more questions. All right. With that, then, I'm going to thank you, Prof. Jonathan, for your really insightful and important presentation. And the research that you are doing is so necessary, not only in the Netherlands, but all over the world, and especially here in South Africa. We do keep our eyes on Europe and on the Netherlands because of just the ties between the countries. And I think there's a lot to learn. I think your presentation also highlights the competing interests within climate change and agriculture, between consumers and producers. And we didn't even go into, we only spoke now about climate change and emissions. We didn't even really speak about animal welfare in industrial farming. And that is also another contentious issue. So I think the topic of agriculture and climate change evokes a lot of emotions from different role players and stakeholders. But thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate it. It was a pleasure to have you here, and I will definitely be in contact with you to speak to my students in international environmental law about this topic. It's questions I get a lot of questions from students about this, and there are quite a few students working on this topic as well. But yes, the presentation has been recorded and will be made available on our YouTube channel and will be uploaded. And perhaps if you can, it would be great if you could share your slides with us, and then I can send that out on the mailing list as well. But this was the first global environmental law webinar series that we are doing on our own. We are still running our series with the Dalai Lama Institute, but the calendar for the rest of the year will be shared for that shortly. We have another event, sorry, just the last announcement from me, on the, I think it's the 17th of August, where we will be speaking to Amy Wilson. She's from Animal Law Reform, and she's going to speak about animal welfare in South Africa. She's going to look at trends internationally and also bring it closer to home. So that also raises, as I said, such interesting questions when we think about industrial farming. But okay, thank you so much again for joining us, Jonathan. I hope you have a lovely afternoon further there.
Thank you very much, Angela. I really liked this whole session. So thank you for your attention, everybody, and have a nice day.
Thank you, and thanks to our participants for joining us.